It is so awesome to be here with all of you and part of this speaker series. I'm going to talk about two things, and then I know we have a Q&A session. First thing I'm going to talk about is a little bit about entrepreneurship in the age of innovation and disruption, and specifically what a lot of the new technology has brought on in that regard. The second thing I'm going to do is I have a personal passion and professional passion around entrepreneurship. So I thought I would just share some of my advice, and I know some of this class is built around a case study and working together on a specific project, and so hopefully you can incorporate some of that into that project, but I also hope that some of you frankly go on to be entrepreneurs and do some really meaningful things in terms of changing the world, and hopefully some of the things that I share you'll at least take with you in some small way. So what I thought I would do is start out with a little bit on my background, just so you understand my journey and my perspectives. And I started my career off with the Kellogg Cereal Company as a packaged good marketer. And interestingly enough, I was the person that was responsible for expanding that company in many parts of Asia Pacific. So I got a chance very early on in my career to live in many areas within the region. It started my love affair with Asia, with the people, the cultures, and frankly, I haven't looked back. I've spent the last 25 years of my life living in Asia Pacific, and so I have to thank my early days at Kellogg for doing that. When I ended up at Kellogg's, I was actually living in Guangzhou, so there's my affinity, some of my connection with China. I was running a cereal manufacturing plant and an export business, and so it was an awesome experience. I then moved on to digital, and as a marketer at heart, I really understood that, look, the promise of the internet in terms of its scale and its impact was unparalleled, and it was really attractive to me. And so I've been very fortunate enough to work with some very large digital companies and scaling them throughout Asia Pacific. So eBay, Skype, most recently I'm at Facebook for the last 4 years. I manage the marketing and sales solutions across the region. I've also done a whole bunch of startups, and 3 in particular that I've been deeply involved in. Interestingly enough, in another connection with China, Vendio was bought by Alibaba. So there you go. Also, most recently, I ran as a co-founder of a company called Travel Mob, which was acquired by HomeAway. I've also am a pretty active mentor and investor in early stage companies. I'm also part of a number of venture capital companies as a limited partner and trying to invest. So the point of all of this is not necessarily my background, but I have a passion and a history around entrepreneurship. And I also add to that some very unique experiences from Facebook. So one of the things that I really love about this speaker series is that because Facebook is such a large platform, we have so many different perspectives that are represented. So currently we have over 65 million businesses that are built on top of Facebook, that have active Facebook pages. And that's huge. And the reason why that matters is oftentimes we have a front row seat to some of the opportunities, some of the challenges that these businesses are facing. And so with all of that as the background, let me give you the headlines on where I think things are at today. There has never been a better time to be alive. There has never been a better time to be an entrepreneur. And there has never been a better time to be an entrepreneur in China. And let me roll through some of the reasons why on this. First off, if you look at things globally, as pessimistic as sometimes things are in the world, the reality is I take a very optimistic and hopeful view of things. If you look at education and literacy, it has never been higher than it is today. If you look at life expectancy, it's never been higher than it is today. If you think about poverty and hunger, it's never been at a lower point than it is today. And believe it or not, we're a more peaceful world. So if you look at wartime deaths as a proxy, it's at a lower point in recent history than it's ever been. And then you think about China, and I'm telling you what you already know and what you already live, but 30% of the GDP growth in the world is coming out of China. And there's a list of proxy metrics that we can use to just better exemplify the opportunity that all of us are seeing in China. but I just picked a few. So if you look at patent development, number one in China. If you take a look at e-commerce, an industry that essentially 2 decades ago didn't even exist, it was nascent, and here you have nearly 50% of all e-commerce in the world that's happening out of China. And then you think about the proxy for success longer term and investment in things like education and engineers, and China is helping lead the way in that regard. And all of that starts to add up to just an awesome time to be an entrepreneur and an entrepreneur in China. And you add to that some of what's going on at a macro standpoint, and it's really exciting. So I like to think of it this way. If you look at what's going on in the outside world, we are now in the 4th industrial revolution. And what I think is really interesting about this assertion is that if you look at the previous 3 industrial revolutions, it was generally all around mass production, automation. But what's different about this industrial revolution is it tends to be around connections between people, connections between businesses, how well you're harnessing bits and bytes is a whole new world. And the ability to enter markets, the barriers have never been lower, access to capital has never been higher. And if you look at the enablers that are making this happen, it's never been more obvious than it is right now. So whether or not it's connectivity on the internet, whether or not you're looking at things like the mobile phone, where just across Asia, people are spending more time on mobile devices and consuming their information than they are any other medium, traditional TV, print, or even frankly in many areas, mobile has surpassed desktop consumption as well. And then you look at things like AI. I understand that Jan had a fantastic part of the speaker series just last week. And so you think about what that represents for innovation and disruption, and it's pretty motivating, pretty optimistic. And no doubt the capital markets are recognizing that as well. I thought that this was an interesting chart. What this does is take a look at 2001. These are the top 5 most valuable companies according to market cap. And in 2001, it's dominated by companies that were heavy infrastructure driven. And whether or not it's Exxon, which is oil and gas, Citibank building out financial services, certainly folks like Walmart that have built out massive retail structures. And then you look at where we're at in 2016, and all 5 of the top companies from a market cap perspective are what you would consider to be new technology companies. And that's where the market is going. And what's even more compelling about this is if you take a look at the average age of the companies, and so go back to the 2001 row, the average age was 91 years old of each one of the companies in 2001 of the top 5. If you look at the top 5 in 2016, it's 26 years old. And so the speed by which these companies are coming up has never been at the pace that it is today. Further emphasizing that, if you take a look at the average lifespan today of an S&P company, it's about 15 years. That means that a company is either acquired or gone in about 15 years. Amazing when you think about what that represents just from a historical perspective. And this is one that I love, which you think about the pipeline of innovation and disruption. And what this is a chart around unicorns. Unicorns being private companies with a valuation of north of $1 billion. You go back to 2009, and essentially there were a couple of unicorns that existed in the world. You look at where we're at today, and there's over 200 unicorns that are out there. And just visually, you can pick up how quickly the pace of growth has happened. And that disruption and innovation is happening across the board. The mistake is a lot of times people will consider this just to be an innovative business model. That disruption and innovation is actually impacting all aspects of the business. You heard Lori talk about the way that we think about culture at Facebook, the way that we hire people, the way that you think about your consumer expectations. Every aspect of business has changed because of the new technologies. This is a great chart that a colleague at Facebook, and matter of fact, my boss, the way that she talks about industries. And again, I put this in the context of we have 65 million businesses that are building themselves on top of Facebook. And she thinks about it in 4 different categories. And it doesn't really matter what the industry is, but it goes like this. Every industry has essentially these A and B type players, these big traditional companies that are well-funded, lots of people, and they're generally in the process of fighting for growth. They're talking about market share and growth, and when they talk about innovation, typically speaking, it's iteration on the products that they already have. And then along comes the disruptors, what I would say is the X and the Ys. These folks are thinking about things entirely differently. They're well-funded, they're rapidly growing, they've embraced oftentimes new technology. A lot of them end up being mobile first because that's where the world is going. And then there's the Zs, and these Zs are essentially, they're the disruptors that just didn't execute, or when you look at how well they were received in the market, it was a failure. And I love this quote from Bezos, who is considered obviously to be one of the folks leading the disruption, but he talks about the fact that he believes that even Amazon is going to be disrupted. He's just trying very hard to make sure that it doesn't happen in his lifetime. Let me take you through, I think, a real-world example of just how this is going. And again, this is industry after industry. I'm going to take a very traditional one, automotives. So let's take General Motors. If you were to go back 10 years ago and ask General Motors what their competitive set was, or what they spend a lot of time thinking about, they would be thinking a lot about the traditional car companies, right? So it's Honda, it's Kia, it's Volkswagen. These are the companies that I worry about. And then there was a shift that happened, right? The technology changed. New technology comes in. It's now moving more and more towards self-driving cars, right? And now suddenly your competitive set is no longer the traditional car companies. You're thinking increasingly about it's Google, it's Apple, it's Tesla. And then something even more fundamental happens, right? What happens is the mindset of the consumer, their users, the people that are purchasing cars change. It used to be a rite of passage when you get a car. So I'd either try to show my status by buying a car, or when I got my driver's license, my rite of passage was to own a car. If you look at where the millennials are at today, it's not about that rite of passage. It's simply about a car is transportation. It's A to B. That's how I got to get from area to area. And when you look at it through that lens, now suddenly your competitive set is different altogether, right? It's no longer the car companies. It's no longer the electric car companies. It's folks like Didi, it's folks like Uber, it's your ride sharing. And again, that's happening in every single industry. And what's happening is companies really have three choices, and all of them are super difficult choices. Your choice number one is, how do I redesign my own business model, change my existing business? Choice number two is, can I set up a division or a subsidiary to how to develop new products? And the third choice is, how do I figure out how do I acquire or invest in some of what's going on from a disruptor or innovator side of the equation, which oftentimes sounds really attractive. And as entrepreneurs, there's always a lot of focus around how do I get acquired? But the reality is, if you look at most measures would say that about 90% of acquisitions fail over the long term. So it's a very difficult path to go down. And that makes it super exciting. Makes it exciting for all of us in here. By the way that General Motors has approached it, interestingly enough, is they just invested about $500 million in Lyft, so a DD-style ride-sharing service. And that's how they're looking at it, hoping to learn. But all of this represents an enormous opportunity to be an entrepreneur. The barriers to entry have never been lower. The access to capital has never been more pervasive. The opportunity for disruption based upon the new technologies is super exciting. And so I hope all of you view it that way. Now let me walk you through what I think are my 8 pieces of advice. And I say this again, a little bit from the experience with Facebook and seeing lots of different companies and their challenges and opportunities, and some of my own journey through being an entrepreneur myself. And so the first one I would say is, number one, make sure that you're solving a problem. And Ime talked a little bit about this when he was here. But so oftentimes, especially when you start off with business school students, you're thinking first and foremost, how do I do the business model? When in reality, if you take a look at the biggest, most important companies that are happening today, it comes out of folks that are not thinking necessarily just about the business problem, or not thinking about the business opportunity, but they're thinking about how do you solve an actual problem. And the more significant problem that you're solving, generally speaking, the more success you have with your target audience, with your customer, and then ultimately you're building a business around that. And let me walk you through a few examples. Number one, on the Facebook side, this is a great quote from Mark where he talks about the way that we think about product development. We don't build products to make money. We make money to build better products. And again, it's about how am I solving problems as the paramount way that we're thinking about development. I'll use an Airbnb example. For those of you, hopefully everybody knows Airbnb in the room. Yeah, I think they're fairly popular in China. But for those of you that don't know the story of Airbnb, it started out with a few founders that had a designer background. And the problem that they were trying to solve was there was a big convention for designers in San Francisco, and designers in San Francisco, or designers everywhere in the US, don't make a lot of money. So all of the low-end hotel rooms were already sold out, and therein lies the birth of Airbnb. The opportunity was, and the problem that they were trying to solve is, how do I provide housing for people that is, looking for things other than hotels because the hotels are already sold out? And you pair that with the supply side of the equation, and everybody has a couch, has an extra room, an apartment that is empty, and therein lies the marketplace for Airbnb. Now, what I think is fascinating is when you look at their impact and how they develop themselves over time. And what this chart attempts to do is if you take a look at the hotels. Hotels, there's a range of hotel rooms and chains that are out there. You've got inexpensive rooms and expensive rooms. Where Airbnb came in is they came in below that with the dynamic called couch surfing, which is essentially just sleeping on somebody else's couch or spare bed, spare bedroom. That's where they started off. And as they developed themselves and became more popular, they moved up the food chain. They moved up, and now they're focused more on business travel. And then when they got good at that, they became more around luxury villas. And now if you take a look at Airbnb, not only is it luxury villas, but you can take things like castles, ships, planes. It's amazing the things that you can find on Airbnb. And you could never find that in a hotel type setting. And in fact, they've now also expanded out to services. So you get a chance to, when you're traveling to another place, you can also do services in addition. Here's an example of Airbnb. I rented this. I was recently in New Zealand, and I rented this Airbnb. We put 3 families that I traveled with in one area. It was right on one of the most prominent rivers in Queenstown in New Zealand. And our host was a New Zealander, and we had an awesome experience that we would have never had the ability to experience had we stayed in a hotel. Amazing what they've been able to do. And then you think about, they solved a problem. Now, how is it playing itself out from a financial standpoint? Take a look at, this is the market valuations, and of course, Airbnb is still a private company, but the valuation of Airbnb is already more than any other hotel chain in the world. Amazing. Next one, piece of advice is find your wedge. And what I mean by find your wedge is find your entry point. And Airbnb, I think, was a good example where they came in below the hotels and then worked their way up. I'll give you another classic example. It's the Walmart, Amazon side of things, where Walmart offers breadth. They offer a little bit of everything in these giant structures that are enormously costly to operate, and nobody does it better than they do for that segment. And then you think about what happened with Amazon. Amazon came in and they picked a category that mattered from a breadth standpoint, right? Or excuse me, from a depth standpoint. So they came in on books. That's where they started. Where there was no way that a store like Walmart could carry the depth of book titles necessary to appeal to somebody that was an enthusiast. And they did it online and they maximized the logistics. And then you think of how they used that wedge to go further up. So they started off with books, and then they moved into electronics, and then they moved from electronics into household goods. And now I can get things delivered to me daily from Amazon. And then you look at the Facebook experience. The Facebook experience is really not much different. If you look at the way that Mark started out, he started out the book, and the focus was on Harvard. And then he moved from Harvard to all colleges. And then he moved from all colleges to the general public. So find your wedge, prove out the success, and then walk it up from there. The next piece of advice is around something that I would call embracing the pivot. And embracing the pivot, I love this photo. This is of Mike Tyson. Mike Tyson is a famous boxer for those of you that don't know him. He had a great quote where he said, look, everybody's got a plan until they get punched in the face. And that's so true if you think about life as an entrepreneur. It doesn't, if some of you take the business plans and you go out and you attempt to actually execute this, the thing that you're going to find is no matter how well your plan was done, the world ends up serving you something completely different. Landscapes change, competitive environments change, and as a company, as a startup, as an entrepreneur, you need to be able to embrace the pivot. Otherwise, you're going to be disrupted. People are going to have innovation, and they're going to use it against you, particularly in the age of new technology where things are happening at an unbelievable pace. This is a quote from Clayton Christensen. Clayton Christensen is the head of the business school at Harvard, and I think he has some very profound thoughts around disruption and innovation. His assertion is that all companies are destined to fail. And certainly when you look at some of the numbers that I put up at the start of this, a lot of this is proving itself out. And the reason why he says that is that if you think about what companies do as they become more successful, they hire super smart people, and they generally put those smart people to work on the existing products. And those people do really smart things on the existing products. You know, they'll add a few benefits in an incremental type of way. They'll optimize the cost structure and the distribution. But what ends up happening is they miss out on the disruption or the innovation that are happening in very meaningful ways. So companies are unable to survive because they build these large legacy businesses that they just simply can't disrupt. They run into margin pressure. They run into a focus on the current customer, which generally wants iteration on the existing product versus the right customer of what it's going to take to succeed for the long term. And let me give you a few examples. So I'll give you three. Two of these missed the pivot, and one of them made the pivot. And so the classic example of Kodak, right? Go back to the 90s. Kodak, from a film and a camera perspective, they owned 70% of the market. They owned it. And along comes digital cameras. Obviously, you don't need film anymore. Kodak refused to embrace the pivot because they didn't want to go and cannibalize their existing film business. And because they couldn't embrace that pivot, they missed it. And in 2011, they filed for bankruptcy. You then move to the story of Blockbuster and Netflix. And Blockbuster, for those of you that don't know, a very large video rental chain. In many respects, they were very innovative in the 90s. They took an organized retail approach to video rentals, and in many respects disrupted a lot of the local video rental stores. They were crushing it, over $6 billion in sales. And then some new technology came in. It moved from video rental to DVDs. And as part of that technology change, along comes a company, Netflix, that says, look, you don't need to go to the store anymore. I'll do a subscription model with my DVD. And then the technology changed again, right? It moved from DVDs to now it's digital downloads. We know the rest is history, but what happened as part of that is Blockbuster, that was in the driver's seat, they missed the pivot, and they also filed for bankruptcy. Even more interesting is that Blockbuster had the opportunity to buy Netflix in the year 2000, and they didn't. And so history, sometimes brutal. Yep. Let me give you the context with our own story at Facebook. So if you were to go back to this chart is 2012, external data, this was the amount of time that people were spending on Facebook, about 15 hours a month approximately. And if you look at the breakdown between mobile and desktop, relatively the same, or roughly 50-50. The problem is in 2012, that's when the pivot started to happen in a really dramatic way towards mobile. And Facebook was born out of a desktop, and we weren't prepared for mobile. Part of it is we had made a technology bet on HTML5, which turned out not to work out for us, but also structurally, we weren't geared up for what it took to be a mobile-first company as that technology started to take off. And if you were to go back and you look at the news headlines around that time, and this is one that I like in particular, some of the pressure was, look, Mark is in over his hoodie. The pressure from the outside community, from the investors, from technologists were we going to be able to compete in what was fast becoming a mobile world? And one of the things that Mark did, a real credit to his leadership, is he held what we would say is a fairly famous now town hall meeting within Facebook, an all hands. And we talked about what it took to pivot to become a mobile-first company. And what that meant is no longer were we going to develop products and develop them on a desktop and then try and, after we take those products and shoehorn them into a small screen on a mobile environment, we were going to develop first and foremost for a mobile environment and only secondarily think about how to develop for the desktop, because that's where our users were going. We also reshaped the organization. And so in 2012, the way that we were structured is we had a whole bunch of folks that were mobile specialists. And once we would develop a product, you would hand it off to the mobile specialist. And they were the ones that would figure out how to take that product or that idea and best deliver it in a mobile environment. Well, in areas, especially new technology that you care about, that you're a core competency, and it was clear we had to be mobile first, you can't relegate that to a group of specialists. Everybody in the company needs to be a specialist. And so at that time, Mark said, look, going forward, every person is going to be trained in mobile development. And that's the pivot that we took as a company. And if you look at where things ended up today, so right now in 2016, good news is people are using a lot more Facebook. So, roughly 22 hours every single month, external data. But 100% of all of the growth, 100% has come from mobile. So if you take a look at our desktop consumption or time spent or engagement, it's actually down from where it was. And so that's an example of how we as Facebook have embraced the pivot. Fourth area that I'll talk about is that culture beats strategy. And we had Lori here, and she talked about people and culture and the importance of that. And I can't underscore that enough in a lot of the startups and entrepreneurs that I deal with. This is a quote from Ben Horowitz. Ben Horowitz is one of the founders of Andreessen Horowitz, so one of the most successful and famous venture capital firms in Silicon Valley. And his argument is, look, when he interacts with startups and entrepreneurs, he likes to see a focus on three things. One, people, two, product, and three, problems. And he wants it done in that order. And what he asserts is, look, if you don't take care of the people first, the other two just simply don't matter. And back to the conversations around pivots and what's going on in the age of innovation and disruption, unless you get the people right, when you get punched in the face, when you need to make the pivot, right? When it's a full contact sport, if you don't have the people and the operating system in place in order to go through that, you're just simply not going to succeed. And one of the things that Lori talked about deeply is our culture and the values that we hold dear. This is, I always think about this, and the way I describe it to people is this is our operating system for the organization, for the people. And I love the fact that so many of our posters are up around the walls here. So thank you very much. Thank you very much for that. The one particular call out that I find to be most helpful when I meet with entrepreneurs is this concept right here. And as part of having an open and transparent culture like we do at Facebook, to me, one of the key ways that it manifests itself or needs to manifest itself is your ability to talk about tough issues and problems. And that's generally not the way that human nature is hardwired, right? None of us likes to talk about bad news. But the reality is, in order to succeed, particularly with how well things or how quick things are moving in today's day and age, what I think about is the lag time between identifying problems and actually discussing the problems and trying to fix the problems ends up being a key determinant for whether or not that company will be successful. So oftentimes you'll run into companies that operate in a reality distortion field. Everything they tell you is the 10 things going awesome with their company, right? What I really love to see is I really love to understand, okay, great, I get it, some good things going on. Where are the problems? What are the things that we need to work on in order to become better? And that ends up being a key indicator of success. The next one I'll talk about, number 5, is being a learning organism. And I'll start this one out with another quote from Mark. One of the things he oftentimes will talk about is the people in the companies that learn the fastest are the ones that win. And again, in this rapidly changing pace of new technology, that's absolutely critical. And to the extent that so many of the new technologies offer us the connectedness and the data, the bits and the bytes, all of us should be seeking answers to the difficult questions and the business problems that we have. One of the things I always advise companies on is that if not your first employee, you should make sure that one of your early employees ends up being a data scientist, somebody that understands the number, right? That understands the numbers and the behavior that's going on. This is about testing, it's about iterating, it's about learning. Those 3 things. If you can master those 3 things and do it with data, you'll be in good shape. The next thing I'll talk about is focus on real business results. And I do this being a marketing guy at heart. But so often when I talk with a lot of the businesses that are built on top of Facebook or entrepreneurs or startups, they're overwhelmed with a lot of the acronyms or the different ways that you could think about marketing in the world. And I'm here to say that a lot of that is just super misguided. Instead of focusing on things like, likes, tweets, shares, CPM, CPCs, CPIs, and the acronyms continue to go on, what I encourage everybody to do in your business is to think about what's the real business outcomes that you're trying to focus on, right? And so if you're a travel company, it's not about what's my CPI or CPV, it's about, am I selling more trips? If I'm an e-commerce company, what are the transactions and repeats that are actually taking place? And as part of that, I always advocate, look, make sure that you're taking a full funnel approach to how you're thinking about marketing. So it's everything from awareness and consideration all the way through the funnel down to loyalty and advocacy. So often what I'll see these companies that they'll just take a piece of the funnel. So let's say I'm an app developer and they'll focus on, okay, I'm gonna take I got some new venture capital funds and I'm gonna invest that on how do I get my downloads around my apps. And oftentimes what ends up happening is if that's your only focus, you've spent millions of dollars on getting your app downloaded only to find out that nobody's using your app on the back end. So make sure that you're looking at the full funnel approach to how you're thinking about your business, how you're thinking about your marketing. The next one that I'll talk about is staying humble and staying paranoid. And I say this just because of, look, how quickly things are moving. And as you go out and try and disrupt or innovate, other people are going to try and do the same thing to you. And if any of you get a chance to go to the headquarters at Facebook, you'll see this sign that welcomes everybody. Very cool, right? The big thumbs up. But what you don't really realize is the backside of that sign. If you go behind that sign, this is what you see. And you realize that that sign is just a tarp. It's a big tarp that we put over the Sun Microsystems sign. Sun Microsystems used to have the campus before Facebook. And we intentionally leave it this way, right? And we intentionally leave it this way because we know if we don't stay relevant, if we don't continue to innovate, that we too will go the same way that Sun Microsystems has gone. The last kind of piece of advice that I would have for you is make sure that you care more than the other guy. And the point on this one is, this is Mark when he was 19 years old and in Harvard working on the book. And what's fascinating is if you go back and you look at the landscape at that time, there were plenty of other companies that should have succeeded more so than Facebook, right? There's companies with deeper marketing, bigger networks, lots more engineers, but yet Mark did it based on a guy in a dorm room. And if you ask him what was the key to his success, one of the things that he'll say is, look, I was very focused and I cared more than the other guy. I cared more than anybody else. This was the problem that I focused on when I get up in the morning and when I go to sleep at night. So that's a little bit what I have to offer. I also was asked to recommend a couple of books, or a book, and in typical fashion, I recommend 2 books. So the first book that I recommend is The Innovator's Dilemma, which is Clayton Christensen. I referred to him earlier on in my presentation, but it's a really great read on innovation and disruption. The second book, and if any of you have read this, you'll probably laugh, is Who Moved My Cheese? Who Moved My Cheese is kind of a kid's story, frankly. And you could probably read that book in about 5 minutes, but it's a story of essentially some mice that are in search of cheese. And as you would expect, the cheese continues to move. For me, it's just been something that I refer to throughout my life, and it's just been really a good metaphor and a reference, because we're all living in an area that is just moving so quick. So with that, thank you again so much for letting me be part of this speaker series. And I look forward to the Q&A.